On this episode of This Week in Linux, Linus Torvalds gave his opinion on WireGuard, Lubuntu announced that they're taking a new direction, LineageOS launches their annual summer survey, and the Hiri company gives their experience for selling proprietary software on Linux. Then we'll check out some distro news from Slackware, OpenWRT, Ubuntu LTS, and RebeccaBlackOS. Later in the show, we'll check out some Linux gaming news, as well as the 5 reasons to switch to Linux from Windows, as written by a Forbes contributor. And we'll have a look at an interesting blog post from the KDE Team about Plasma's engineering, and a new Spectre Variant vulnerability called NetSpectre. All that and much more coming up. I'm Michael Tennell with TuxDigital, and this is your source for Linux news. Before we get started, I just want to let you know you could join the Telegram group or the Discord server for the channel. And the Discord server is open to everyone, and you could have discussions with the rest of the community as well as myself in both the Telegram group and the Discord servers. We also have subreddits for both TuxDigital and This Week in Linux. They're not very active because I haven't used them that much, but I could work on that in the future, hopefully. You could also join the Steam group if you'd like to play games with the rest of the community as well as myself. And also follow the channel and the show on Twitter, Mastodon, Diaspora, and many more. To find out more, you can go to tuxdigital.com/contact. Up first in the show, Linus Torvalds had an opinion he provided on WireGuard about whether or not it should be included into the kernel. And this is a really interesting thing because it's, Linus is known for when he gets put into news articles or podcasts, it's related to some kind of rant he's made. And this one's kind of nice because it's like sort of a rant wrapped in a compliment. Here's what he said about WireGuard. He says, I see that Jason actually made the pull request to have WireGuard included in the kernel. Can I just once again state my love of WireGuard, and it gets merged soon. Maybe the code isn't perfect, but I've skimmed it, and compared to the horrors that are OpenVPN and IPsec, it's a work of art. So it's a compliment, a little bit of a jab in there for other things. Anyway, if you're not familiar with WireGuard, WireGuard is basically it's a VPN that uses cryptography built into it, and the WireGuard website describes it as an extremely simple yet fast and modern VPN system. It aims to be faster, leaner, simpler, and more useful than IPsec. It also says WireGuard is designed for a general-purpose VPN for tunneling on embedded interfaces and supercomputers alike. So essentially, it's like a VPN tunnel that could be built into the kernel at some point, which, if it does, that'd be really awesome. Linus seems to be a big fan of WireGuard, and with a good reason. Lubuntu is taking a new direction with the upcoming release of Lubuntu 18.10, and also beyond, of course, too. They're taking a new direction, and they've posted a blog post on their website at lubuntu.me, and the blog post is to help everyone understand what the transition and the focus for the team will be for in the future. Essentially, what they're talking about is that Lubuntu is known for being a lightweight distro and used for computers that are really old or something like that. And in my opinion, it's kind of like it's got a reputation of being like the secondary distribution you put on some old hardware that you're not really using. And I think that's a unfortunate reputation. So I'm kind of glad that they're doing this because they're modernizing the whole ecosystem of the distro, and I think that's really cool. So I'm really excited to see what happens, especially what they're going to be using, which is LXQt or LXQT, as some people know it. And this will be replacing the LXDE desktop environment. Now, the reason why they're doing this is because hardware these days is kind of abandoning the old, like 32-bit infrastructure of hardware, so that you don't really need a incredibly light DE. Now, that's not the main reason, but there's essentially LXDE is dead. Now, you could argue that it's not really dead because there's a little bit of maintenance, but as far as like the fact that the vast majority of the LXDE team has abandoned LXDE and moved on to LXQt and are working on that, it means that LXDE is never ever going to get a port to Wayland or anything like that. So that means you're looking at, or the Lubuntu team would be looking at potentially using LXQt, LXDE, sticking with that, and just accepting the bit rot or forking LXDE into a whole new thing and having to port everything to Wayland, which means they'd have to essentially redevelop the entire system with GTK3. And understandably, they don't really want to do that. But I think the best option would be what they chose, which is LXQt. And I'm very much interested in finding out what happens with this, because LXQt is a very good desktop environment. It's a light desktop environment, but also is very powerful and modular. So it's still using OpenBox as the window manager and all that. So it's very similar. It's just like maybe 10-20% heavier than the previous LXDE. So you get all the modern features and benefits while still being relatively light, but just not being the absolute lightest you could offer. But it wasn't even really the lightest possible anyway. You could use OpenBox directly and have a ridiculously light system, or one of the other 20 window managers that are even lighter. Now, I think this is a good idea, and I'm glad they're doing it, and I can't wait to try it out. So if you have any thoughts on this, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, and let me know what you think. And the last thing I wanted to say about this particular piece of news is, if you think about it, Lubuntu started 10 years ago. And the hardware from 10 years ago, if you're looking at, we want to support 10 years old hardware or a little bit older, something like that, the hardware that is now 10 years old is still relatively powerful. And you can even argue that it's like the introductory level hardware. If you had like really good hardware 10 years ago, you have basically introductory hardware now. So the comparison between when Lubuntu was first started supporting 10, 15-year-old hardware is vastly different from the current state of it supporting 10 to 15-year-old hardware. It could still do that, but if it wanted to support the super old, you're looking at like 20-year-old, 25-year-old hardware. And I think this is a good option for that, because you still get the lightweight aspects, but you get a much more modern system. So anyway, like I said before, let me know what you think in the comments below. GNOME 3.30 has entered beta, and so this GNOME 3.30 is the anticipated next iteration of the GNOME desktop. And the final release is scheduled for September 5th, but you can download the beta now if you'd like to. And some distros may include the beta for testing purposes if you'd like to check that out. What's coming in this new version for GNOME 3.30 is the Nautilus File Manager is going to receive a lot of improvement, especially with some improved Flatpak experience. The search engine enhancements for finding files easier is being improved, so that's great. Nautilus will be receiving touch support for menus and views improved visuals, so you'll be able to do touchscreen support much easier than previous versions, which is nice, especially when Purism probably appreciates that. Maybe they even helped make it as far as like the touch aspects to it. And there's going to be a lot of core component updates and app updates across the whole stack, but like they normally do with like Epiphany and the calendar application and things like that. So if you'd like to find out more, you can find a link to the show notes and check out what's the latest versions, and also you can check out the Flatpak nightly builds of it, so you can do like a test run of the latest version. Up next in the show is KDE Plasma has a blog post out there about the engineering Plasma and the extensions system. So this is a really cool blog post if you're interested in how Plasma is built and put together. They explain quite a few things that I wasn't aware of, but also there's a lot of things that they're just kind of clarifying certain things. So if you're interested, you can check out the link in the show notes. But for the overview is that they're describing that the shell UI and the compositor are isolated in separate processes, which are Plasma Shell and Kwin, or Quinn, whatever. Not sure which one it's supposed to be. If you go to their section on their website, it says pronounced as one word. Well, both Kwin and Quinn are both one word, so be more specific. And anyway, this allows them to separate the processing between the shell and the compositor, so that if you need to restart your desktop, you don't have to worry about losing any apps or anything like that, because they're separated between the window manager and the desktop shell itself. They're also working on a new multi-process architecture, which will make it even more separated, so that you can have like the extension system separated from the shell and the compositor and all this other stuff that adds extra resilient from crashing, and also makes it have the ability to a little bit of security benefits as well for, like, for example, if you have an untrusted extension code or something like that, you could sandbox it away from the rest of your system. That is really cool. Now, if you're looking at the chart right here, it says that the extensions are inside of the Plasma shell. And the way this is kind of confusing is it implies that it makes people think sometimes that the extensions will break Plasma if they break. But that's not necessarily the case, because they're kind of more, they're designed to be a modular structure. So what's really cool about the way that Plasma is built is that everything is an extension, essentially. So like the panel system, the menu widgets, the desktop, even the desktop itself, like the way the icons are laid out and things like that, everything is essentially a widget. So because the shell encompasses all the widgets, it allows them to be modified and moved and replaced and all kinds of things without damaging the shell in any way. So it's a really cool structure that if you would like to learn more about, you can find a link in the show notes. And another thing about it is that they're going to be talking about the upcoming changes and the differences between like what the new multiprocess architecture is going to be talked about in the upcoming Academy, which is the conference for KDE. And this conference is starting pretty soon on August 11th. So by the time this show is released, it'll be this coming weekend. So I'll be checking out that for throughout the Academy to bring you all the cool news from the event in a future episode. So yeah. Up next in the show is the summer survey, or attack of the feedbacks, from LineageOS. So LineageOS is doing a survey that they're doing for their users or potential users who would like to provide their opinions for various different things like style API, the UI of various different components, applications by default, things like that. So you can like rate various different applications. So specifically, they're asking you to seek information related to what you think of the various apps, like the Clock app, the Gallery app, the Messaging app, things like that. So if you'd like to participate and provide your information, your opinion, then feel free to check out the link in the show notes for the survey. And just so you know, they say that privacy is important to us. As such, we do not run metrics on devices. In light of this, we would like you to contribute and provide your opinions freely, and the window is open now for doing so. So as you can see, like this is related to the fact that they don't actually take any of your information while you're using LineageOS. So if you'd like to give them information about what you'd like to be improved or changed or fixed or anything like that, this would be a good time to do that. So check it out, the link in the show notes. Next up in the show is kind of a repeat, sort of, not really, but last episode I talked about OpenWRT as a replacement for Cisco firmware routers and stuff like that, or getting a whole open firmware for your router in general. And you could say that I kind of predicted this, even though I actually had no idea. Within a couple days after releasing the episode, OpenWRT released a new version of their system. But what's really interesting about this is the first release for OpenWRT since the LEDE project merged back into OpenWRT. If you're not familiar, OpenWRT is a custom firmware you can flash onto your router, and it gives you a lot more control over your router rather than the ISP or the manufacturer of the router if you purchase it like outright online or something like that. I don't know if you did it if you were to flash your firmware on a router that you got from your ISP, if that would even, it might void your warranty or something. It might even be against their terms. I don't know. But still, OpenWRT is a really great project, and I'm very happy to see that, to know that LEDE is back into the same project and that they have now released. This is a really big release because it incorporates over 4,000 commits since the previous branching of the LEDE 17.01. And there's a lot of improvements, such as the system upgrade procedure has been improved and made it much easier to do. They've improved the network userland, updated the Linux kernel, which is always great. They've added mitigations for Spectre and Meltdown, which is absolutely important, and a lot of other things. So if you'd like to Actually, one more thing, the auto rollback functionality to revert configuration changes is really cool. So I'm happy to see that it's been added. So if you'd like to see more about OpenWRT, you can find a link in the show notes. Up next in the show is Hiri's company that makes a mail client for, well, Linux and other platforms for using Microsoft Exchange or Office 365. They shared their experience in a blog post about selling proprietary paid product on Linux. This is an interesting topic because this is something that's very rarely done from a company that expresses their experience between dealing with the community, finding the format to use for releasing on Linux and things like that, and their interactions with the whole overall system of distributing Linux software and dealing with support and things like that. This is an interesting blog post for them to provide because it also gives them they give their opinion of how Linux could improve and how companies who'd like to support Linux can do so and what they should do in order to do it. So it's an interesting blog post, and if you'd like to find out more about or read it yourself, you can find a link in the show notes. But just like a brief overview of what they were talking about, they say that they do believe that it's possible to make a living out of selling Linux software to Linux users alone. So exclusively to Linux users, you could make a profit and make a living off doing it. That is a really interesting thing because a lot of people don't think that that's true. And I, as a Linux user for a very long time, I am happy to finally see some companies that are realizing this because it is totally a true thing. You could, because the dedication to the platform that the Linux users have is way more than any other platform. Just by releasing software on Linux, you're going to get attention, and that, especially if you're a big company, you're going to get attention for it, and that's something that a lot of companies should consider. Just by giving us attention, you get attention, right? So anyway, another thing they said is that most of the paid Linux users are through word of mouth and not through advertising, which is the opposite for the Windows and Mac people. They haven't noticed anything that distinguishes Linux users from everyone else. They're no more cost conscious than Mac or Windows users. They are definitely willing to pay for software, which totally agree. That's why you could make a living off of using it. But anyway, they did find some negatives, and those are true things. They said that unfortunately the fundamentalist FOSS mentality, as how they described it, that they encountered on Reddit is still alive and well. Some Linux blogs and podcasts simply wouldn't give them the time of day. Now, they wouldn't say which blogs or podcasts those were, and I can go ahead and tell you it wasn't mine, because, But anyway, security and privacy are very important to Linux users, which is very true, because, open source and free culture is very important, but in some cases it's hard to justify for a company to release their software as open source. Now, I would really prefer, of course, that if every piece of software was open source, that would be my preference. But it's not necessarily a practical thing to think about, like to even imply. Like if a company says, I would like to make software for Linux, I go, thank you very much, regardless if it's open source or not. But there are a lot of people who don't have that opinion and would attack a company for having the audacity to provide proprietary software. Now, I understand the fundamental reason of why they think that. It's just not a practical thing. So I guess we could discuss that in the comments below if you'd like to. Anyway, moving on with the blog post, they talked about how in order for them to finally convince to make software for Linux after having dealt with the community that was very negative to them, they were approached by Canonical, and they said that they were super helpful and they wanted to help them make the snap of their software. So they're saying that if for tips for developers is they want you to think about connecting to Canonical as far as like making snap software. So that's interesting because that puts the foremost thing is to use snap as a format so that you can kind of avoid a lot of the issues of releasing software on Linux, because releasing software on Linux is painful because deb files and RPMs and tarballs and all these other things that are not necessarily compatible with each other. Whereas if you use a snap or a Flatpak or an app image, you have a lot more, a lot broader support. And it just makes more sense to use one of those. Or release a version for all three if you want to. I'd be okay with that. And I'm happy if someone supports Linux. If someone creates their software to support Linux, I appreciate that by itself. Now, I would absolutely prefer it to be open source as well, but I still appreciate their efforts to support it at all. So if you're a developer and you're looking to support Linux, you should absolutely check out this blog post. And if you're just curious about what they've said in it, you can find a link in the show notes. Up next in the show is some unfortunate news, but not surprising news, is that there's another Spectre vulnerability variant found, and this one is called NetSpectre because it can be performed remotely. So the Linux vulnerability shows how Spectre can be used across cached data remotely. One of the benefits of why this is not as bad as it could be is that it takes a long time to do it. So it could be anywhere between 3-4 hours or so before you get something useful you're running this exploit. But the fact that this exploit can be done means that it could be improved possibly in the future. So it's good that mitigations are being worked on to address this particular exploit or vulnerability. Anyway, it's not really an exploit because it doesn't exist yet, but it's a vulnerability itself. So this is not good, but it's good that we know about it now. And people are already working on fixing it, and that there currently isn't an exploit to speak of. But there is technically a proof of concept that has been made that is just showing that it's possible. So anyway, you might not be interested in hearing about new vulnerabilities on the Spectre meltdown aspects. They're going to continue. I'd be surprised if there's not at least 5 more or so. There's probably going to be a lot of these because there's already quite a few, and I think they're probably going to end up about over a dozen. So we're about halfway there right now, so I think it's going to continue. How severe will these be? Who knows? But they're not going to be good. But anyway, yep. Let's move on to something else. Up next in the show is the GPD Pocket 2 crowdfunding campaign. Now, this is kind of a negative thing, but it's a topic that I like to discuss as far as like what your interest is and things like that. So the GPD Pocket 2, it was announced that it's not going to support by default any Linux-based system, or they're not going to provide a Linux model. Whereas the GPD Pocket 1 did provide an Ubuntu-based version. So what was interesting about the previous version is that the Ubuntu version was actually like hardware-wise inferior. So they kind of maybe shot themselves in the foot as far as like which one people chose, because the people likely would choose the Windows version, pay slightly more, and get a much more powerful version, and then just remove Windows and put Linux on it. Like, it's possible that that's why they did it, but unfortunately the Linux version is not going to be available in the next version of the GPD Pocket. It's actually kind of a shame because the GPD Pocket 2 does look a lot better, and it has like improved some of the issues that the previous version had. But the price is still kind of excessive. It's like $529 for the new version, which is roughly around the same, about $50, $100 more, depending on the model that you could get for the previous version. It was pretty expensive for both of those. But so the question to you, community, is: do you think that this is a reasonable product for even whether or not it has Windows? So, like, are you bothered by the fact that they've removed the Ubuntu version, even though the previous model, the Ubuntu version, was inferior in general? Or would you be okay with just buying the Windows version and replacing it anyway? Because that's kind of what people did the first version. And also, what about the price? Because the price of the GPD Pocket 2 is pretty high. You could probably get a pretty decent laptop or like 2 Chromebooks for this price. So do you think that this is a reasonable price for this model or this form factor? So it's a 7-inch tiny laptop, basically, or ultra small laptop. And I think it's interesting. I did actually get to play with the GPD Pocket 1 at a conference I was at, thanks to the community member Keith for letting me play with it. And it was really fun to use. because it's surprisingly the keyboard was okay, and I don't know if I'd want to have it as like a consistent, definitely not a daily driver, but like a consistent product to use. I don't know, but it was still fun to try out. So anyway, I'm just curious what your opinions are. So just leave those comments in the comment section below. Next up in the show is some unfortunate news for Slackware. The developer of Slackware has announced, well, not really announced, but he's made a comment on the linuxquestions.org website about some issues they're having with Slackware and his financial issues personally as well. Is a quote from the comment he said is, I've been mulling over exactly how to tell you all this, and I guess this is as good a place as any. The store has been ripping me off horribly, and I'm very nearly broke. I have no evidence that they have ever done anything with donations besides line their own pockets. Yeah, that's some very harsh comments, and I have no reason not to believe him, of course. But he also says, I've not been paid any money by them in 2 years. That was upon the 14.2 release, and followed another long period of time with no income at all. The 14.2 release generated nearly $100,000 in revenue, and the store gave him $15,000. They later said that was overpaying. Obviously, that's totally messed up. But what you can do is that he's also, in this thread, they were talking about potential ways to support him directly. So they were talking about PayPal and Patreon and things like that. He said he's going to look into Patreon, but right now, if you would like to contribute to Slackware and to the development of it, you can look. I'll have a link in the show notes where you can submit PayPal donations to him directly, so you can bypass the store. Potentially even cancel some orders or subscriptions that you have for the Slackware store, because if Slackware's not even getting the money anyway, there's no reason to support their store whatsoever. And in fact, they should probably just take the store off their website. That'd be a good option too. But they might not be able to legally or something. There was some discussions about. He said that how much percentage that the store he owns of the store versus what they own. And unfortunately, he, for some reason, gave them controlling interest of 60% to 40%. So he takes 40% if they give him the money, which they apparently are not giving him anything anyway. Essentially have full control over what they do, which is a very unfortunate situation, because if you run a project or anything, or you run a company, you should always keep at minimum 51% so that they can't do anything against you. It's just not a good idea to do that kind of a structure. So in the future, if you maybe people could learn from this kind of thing, but hopefully Slackware will be able to be funded again, because it is an important distribution. One of the most important distributions, in fact. So hopefully that the community will rally around the Slackware developer and community or ecosystem, and submit some PayPal donations and things like that to get him back on his feet, sort of thing. And maybe he could look into Patreon to do more like a recurring structure, because Patreon is actually probably one of the better solutions for this, because it's a way to kind of rely on that money rather than just hope people will donate. It's it's definitely something you can consider. So if you'd like to read the thread and maybe donate to the Slackware distro, you can find a link in the show notes. Ubuntu 18.04.1 has been released recently, and this is the first point release of the LTS version for 18.04. Now, this is mostly like improving different aspects and just basically adding new features and stuff like that, so that you can have now, like for example, you can have nightlight inside of the GNOME shell improvements. You can also they've updated support for XDG desktop portals, and they've improved support for Thunderbolt device authorization, and a lot of other things. Like example, you can even snap install the latest version of the community theme. I think it's still called that as far as in the package, but they've now branded it to Yaru, or YARU. So if you want to check that out, you can as well. So overall, this is just a basic maintenance update for basically that's what point releases are. But the most important piece of this particular thing is that the 1604 to 1804 upgrade is now available and is being suggested to 1604 users. So if you are using 1604 and you would like to upgrade, you can do so now without having to worry about going through the release, the command line release upgrading, going past the stipulations. Because basically, when the first version of an LTS is released, the Ubuntu team does not issue the suggestion to upgrade until the first point release, which is this one. So there's that if you are a 1604 user. If you are, feel free to continue to use 1604 though, because it still has 3 years left to support. So there's that. But anyway, if you'd like to learn more, you can check out the show notes. And there you go. Up next in the show is RebeccaBlackOS. So maybe you've heard of other distributions like the Justin Bieber Linux distro or the Hannah Montana Linux distro. Maybe you've heard of that. But have you heard of RebeccaBlackOS? This might seem like, why are you putting this on the show? And that's a fair question, because it does seem like a joke, ridiculous distribution, but it actually has some merit to it. They have a new version that came out recently. What's interesting about it is that it's a Debian-based distribution that runs exclusively on Wayland. So you can test out various different things that are Wayland-based, Wayland-specific. So you can test out the Hawaii desktop or the KDE Plasma desktop environment on top of RebeccaBlackOS, and it's oddly enough useful. Now, when I first heard of this, I did assume that this is kind of ridiculous, and, well, it sort of still is, but I really like the fact that they took a distribution that apparently is a joke and made it useful. So just thought you might want to check that out if you were interested in using Wayland for some reason. Up next in the show is an article that the Forbes magazine released for the 5 reasons you should switch from Windows to Linux right now. This article is written by Jason, sorry I'm going to butcher this, but I'm going to try anyway, Evangelo. If you watch this, let me know if I said that right or not. Anyway, so Jason wrote an article that talked about his journey between switching from Windows to Linux. And this article is really cool because it talks about the five reasons, and he goes into like a overview and also like details of why that those particular reasons are worth going to, worth using Linux for. And pretty much everybody knows, who's a Linux fan or watches this show probably can guess quite a few of these reasons. But let's just go ahead and do like an overview of them. And if you'd like to read more details directly, you can find a link to the blog post or the Forbes post in the show notes. But first, he says that Linux gets out of your way. No annoying Cortana pop-ups or pre-installed crapware, essentially. I mean, it doesn't use exactly those words, but the fact that there is software on Windows called PC Decrapifier, I mean, that's actually the name of the software. I mean, that's kind of like a little bit telling. So it's nice to see that people are pointing out like Linux just works and gets out of the way. That's what most people want from their computer. He says, and contrary to popular belief is that you're not a slave to the terminal. You can use Linux now without ever even opening the terminal, which is totally true. And he says that installing software is a lot easier, which is true. I mean, still some cases there's some like nuance that's annoying, but for the most part, you can just use an app store like the Ubuntu software store that's based on GNOME software. But you could use that, or you could use like whatever your distribution comes with. And for the most part, he's referring to Ubuntu. And updates are not a headache at all. Actually, updates are fantastic. If you compare them to Windows, Windows is like, hey, would you like to update? And you're like, no. Then 10 minutes later, hey, would you like to update? You're like, no, postpone for 4 hours. And then all of a sudden it starts automatically updating without your permission and just reboots your computer. Yeah, Linux doesn't do that. And the fact that Linux doesn't actually force you to do updates ever, and even if you do an update, you don't have to reboot your machine most of the time. So that's awesome. And if you get the kernel, the live patching for the kernel set up, you don't even have to do it for the kernel. So like you could pretty much avoid rebooting entirely in those cases. They also point out, like talking about the previous situation where one company was experiencing a negative impact from the community, this particular user or writer has put the number 5 reason to use Linux is the Linux community, because he found a lot of help and a lot of polite people and helpful people who wanted to just help him with his experience. And that is my experience with Linux. I think the vast majority of people who are in the community are fantastic. I think that it's nice to see when people outside of the ecosystem come in and experience what I believe the community to be. That's always nice. If you'd like to read more from this post, you can find a link to the Forbes article in the show notes. Up next in the show, we got some really cool news from thanks to our friends at GamingOnLinux.com. They're talking about they found out that the SteamOS 3.0 is coming, codenamed Clockwerk, and this is a really big update for lots of stuff. Now they've also released a new beta, SteamOS beta, that is prior to Clockwerk, which will have the new updated version of the kernel to 4.16. Updated Mesa to 18.1.5, and updating NVIDIA drivers, as well as improving some support for pre-Vega cards for AMD. So that's before Clockwerk comes out. But when Clockwerk comes out, we don't really have a ton of information, but they've talked about retooling their entire infrastructure for builds of the next version of SteamOS. So what they have confirmed is that SteamOS 3.0 or Clockwerk will be based on Debian 9. So it's not a very fast update, and in fact, it's actually kind of slow considering it takes like Debian to release every 3 years or so, and SteamOS is like a year after that. So it's not quick, but it does show that Valve is still interested in keeping their commitment to Linux and to SteamOS. So even though they're not fast to reiterate new versions, they are still doing it, and that is good to know. If you'd like to learn more about this release as well as the other releases for SteamOS, you can check out the link to GamingOnLinux.com in the show notes. Up next in the show is an update for the Rounds game mode in Ballistic Overkill. If you haven't tried Ballistic Overkill, it is a fantastically fun first-person shooter that is really fast-paced. If you like kind of a slow-paced game, then that's not really what this is. But thanks to Rounds, the Rounds mode, it kind of can be, because Ballistic Overkill is a first-person. You have a certain amount of time, and you just unleash bullets and stuff. It's really fun. Hard to describe, but it's like a class-based system. So like you pick which class you prefer, and then you can just go and battle the rest of the players. Now, Rounds is kind of like like pulling back the fast-paced aspects to it and making it kind of slow it down for the fact that in the regular modes you can die as many times as you want and respawn over and over. But in Rounds, you only have one life per round. So you play multiple rounds for a match, but each round you only have one life. So if you die, you do not respawn. So the goal is to kill all the other people on the other team, or to have more people survive during each round than the other team. So it's an interesting approach to the game because it's a really fast-paced game, and now they're kind of giving it a different vibe that's not, that's much more slow-paced for people who like that style of gameplay. They also added a lot of a lot more servers, and I didn't know this, and I didn't know they were going to do this until we were playing it yesterday. Myself and Das Geek from Destination Linux, we were playing the new mode for Rounds, as well as other community members. If you'd like to join that game, you could go to destinationlinux.org/discord or tuxdigital.com/discord, and you can find us playing in one of those two servers. Because Ballistic Overkill is a really fun game to play, and if you haven't, you should definitely check it out. And you can find a link to that game, as well as a link to the Discord servers in the show notes. Up next in the show is the Humble Sports Bundle. This is a new sports game bundle from the Humble Bundle, and it's actually pretty great because there's a couple games on there I already own that you should definitely check out if you're interested in this kind of game. So first of all, the unfortunate thing about this particular bundle is that the lowest tier does not have any Linux games. So all of these don't work on Linux. But the next tier has 4 Linux games, including Dirt Rally, which is really fun. And I've never heard of Super Blood Hockey, but that sounds interesting. And if you get to the next tier, you can get F1 2017, included for $12 or more. Now, if you also like the motorsport, like the manager type games, there's Motorsport Manager and Football Manager 2018 has a discount code attached to it, so you can get 75% off if you wanted to get that. So anyway, if you haven't checked this out, Dirt Rally and F1 2017 are definitely worth trying. I'm kind of curious about Super Blood Hockey now, so I might get that just to get it. Anyway, so if you're interested in checking out the Humble Bundle for the Sports Bundle, you can find a link in the show notes. And to be upfront about it, the link in the show notes is an affiliate link that will support TuxDigital with a small percentage if you purchase the Humble Bundle through that link. So if you'd like to support the TuxDigital channel and the This Week in Linux show, then you could find a link for the Humble Bundle or Humble Sports Bundle in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on the show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the channel, we have multiple ways to contribute, such as Patreon, PayPal, or even affiliate links. And if you'd like to learn more about that, you can go to tuxdigital.com/contribute. Or you can order the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt by going to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhere. Or if you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhere EU for shipping from Europe. If you'd like some more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episode of Destination Linux, as I'm one of the hosts of that show. Also, special thanks to Ryan, aka Das Geek from Destination Linux, for helping me with production of this particular episode of This Week in Linux. Just a reminder, this show is recorded live on Saturdays, so join us in the live chat room to discuss all the latest Linux news. If you'd like to catch the live stream, then be sure to go to tuxdigital.com/thisweekinlinux. So there you can use the time zone converter to get the live time in your area. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell with TuxDigital, and as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying Linux.